Domains are critical to you. It is a core thing that you're going to have in your team. My answer to you is you will have some sharing mechanism on your team. You will have some malware source of collection, which is usually going to be VTI. You will have some understanding of historical whois records and domain name registrations. And you will have technical analysts that can actually parse through and deal with the data. You're going to have those 4 things, guaranteed. And if you're smart, you'll add tech writers as well. So domains is one of those things that you're going to have. We got to know how to pivot, though. Pivoting is a core skill in any data set. How do I start in one data set, move to another, and know when not to? That's the hard part. Everybody can pivot. Hell, I can automate pivoting. But knowing when you're running down a rabbit hole and to pull out and to go to another tree, or go to another path, that's hard. Sometimes that's more art than science. Largely, though, we don't like pivoting everybody for something called the Kevin Bacon effect. Anybody remember the Kevin Bacon game? It meant the same thing universally wherever you were. Same thing as the Floor is Lava game. They both meant the same thing. You grew up poor, like me. All right, so that's what we did, and we played Floor is Lava. I think there's even a comedian out there that talks about it. He's like, "Hey, Mom, I want a Nintendo." "Oh no, Floor is Lava!" You know, like distract, counter, deny. All right, Kevin Bacon game. What's the Kevin Bacon game? I'm going to talk to Sandra. I'm going to talk to Robert. I'm going to ask you both, how many people does it take to get to Kevin Bacon? And you're going to think, it's no more than 6, but you're going to think, well, I know so-and-so who knows Kevin Bacon. I know Kevin Bacon within 2 pivots, 3 people. And he's going to come up and be like, I know Kevin Bacon. Direct access. Woo, nice. And then all of you, no matter who you are in the world, can get there in 6 hops. It's like the 3 licks of the Tootsie Pop, right? 6 hops can get you to Kevin Bacon or anybody on the planet. What does that mean for us as Intel analysts? You can prove it's China. You could totally pivot enough to get to China. It's probably not China, right? Like, you could do this, but it's not necessarily the real answer. And what that also is analytical leaps. The idea that I'm going to make one jump to one jump to one jump, and I make all these leaps to justify any position I want. So my general recommendation to you is start with a single data point. Pivot through all the different data sources you have, validate it, and identify the relevant ones, then start again. What does that really mean? 2+ pivots. I want you to be able to automate 2 pivots. I should be able to throw any data point into any system I'm using and get 2 pivots out. So in other words, if I give it a hash for a piece of malware, it's going to automatically pull the IP address and the domain. Or it's going to automatically pull additional samples that it's seen. I'll get 2 automatic pivots, but never more than that. Because by the time we get to 3, it's a giant data set. So I can deal with 2 automatic pivots. There are lots of things to pivot off of. IP addresses, domains, accounts, even the unique strings like we talked about with mutexes. Any of these are useful. All that matters is if you have it in your data set or not. As an example, and please, we are to the point in the course on day 3 where I assume you are not going to infect yourself. Okay? All the things you will see from here on out in the course are domains and IP addresses and hashes of malware and malware sites. Please don't go to them. GameMuster.com. All right, I can pivot to automatically registration data. I get an email account now. I can automatically pivot to there. But by the time I do those 2 pivots, I've got tons of data. So now I'm going to come and be a little bit more focused and go, you know what? This IP address is interesting, not all the IP addresses. Show me any files beaconing to that. And so by starting with a domain, I can get to malware samples. Now I've got to have all those data sources. I have a giant data source of malware samples, a giant data source of historical records, a giant data source of domain registrar information. But I can pivot through those data sets off of some very basic principles. We will use a tool called Maltego. It's a very simple little tool. It's a good tool, though. And I can start with that domain, and I can see kind of the pivots out. But each one of them gives me a different route to chase. I could go just off those malware families and identify variants and common mutexes and pivot off that. I could just pivot off the email account and see all the domains that have ever been registered to anything similar in naming conventions to that email account. I can just pivot off of the IP addresses of how long they've been registered for who and all around the world. Any of these routes could take me weeks, I could legitimately spend weeks in data sets. You got to balance. That's the trick. And I can keep going and keep going and keep going. And even just off some basic pivoting, I can get a bunch of pieces of information. So we got to be careful. But one of the ones that we're going to really pivot on, we're going to focus on, is that C2, that domain, the infrastructure. Infrastructure choices of the adversary. And I'm going to break it into 3 classes for you. There's a variety of ways to do C2, but 3 large classes are adversary registered, dynamic DNS, and legitimate but compromised. And it is my hypothesis that each one of these offers up different pros and cons to the adversaries that might help indicate the type of operation you're looking at. Doesn't prove it, no smoking gun, but might indicate. So let's walk through and have a discussion. First one's adversary registered. They reach out, they put in some information, even if fake. Oh yeah, I'm totally at 1601 Pennsylvania Avenue. Okay, cool, whatever, man. They put some sort of services at cleareddefense.com. Probably got hired immediately. No, but we put this information out there. We register a domain. What's the benefit to doing it yourself? What's the benefit to registering your own infrastructure to use as an adversary? Control. 100% control. I control the data. I control the spice. I control the infrastructure. I have control, and I know when it's been acquired by someone else, especially if it's my physical server that I'm running it off of. I can see if somebody's jumping on the server and monitoring me while I'm doing my operations. I've got control. What's the downside? Easily defeatable. Harder to kind of stand up consistently over time. Now I need network engineers and infrastructure engineers and management of all that. It's absolutely easier to track back to. The whole thing, nailed it. That is the answer. The big con about this whole thing is you leave so many breadcrumbs. Even if, well, they're going to use mining operations to get bitcoins, to buy domains from some shady market, I don't care. They may make it harder, but they leave a trail. They can get tracked back to exactly where it is. If an adversary has adversary registered infrastructure, not a given, not a guaranteed, but what might you be thinking in terms of the type of operation they might run? Could be more advanced. I mean, advanced is always a sort of subjective term, but could be offensive in nature. Could not care about getting caught. That's a big one, actually. That's a really good one. You might not care. Dynamic DNS. What is dynamic DNS? The trash panda of the internet? Yeah, what is it? Yeah, somebody else is doing your hosting. And I can just have subdomains, and I can have a ton of domains. And the IP addresses are going to be crazily flying all around the internet. It doesn't matter. I can have roblee.org, and it has like 30 million different IP addresses that I cycle through over a year. Tons of infrastructure choices. The IP address is dynamic. Short TTL, time to live, right? Short time to live. It's going to get a new piece of information. However fast I set it, 30 seconds, 30 minutes, a month, doesn't matter. Usually a lot shorter than a month. But anyways, and it's cheap. Really, really cheap. There's some free providers. Hey, you want a domain? And hey, you want a private key now too? You want a cert? Crap, I'll give you a TLS cert, and I'll give you a domain for free. That's useful. Cybercrime has never been easier. Why might I like this? If I go to a DNS manager, I can see that the @ portion of my domain has one thing, the FTP server has one thing, but the www has a completely different IP address. And they're going to cycle every 30 seconds, and I'm going to get new information. Why? Generally speaking, super flexible. No need to update the implant if the IP is blocked. Put a piece of malware in your system, you block the IP addresses, doesn't matter, new IP address later. Low to no cost, and registration information corresponds to the DDNS provider, not the adversary. So if I'm using DDNS as infrastructure, what are some of my pros and cons? What's some pros of this outside of what I've listed up here? Really hard to attribute, actually. Very, very difficult. What about legitimate but compromised? I'm legitimately going after GrannySmithsBakeShop.com. She used to use it, I don't know if that's a real domain or not, but used to go after and sell delicious blueberry muffins to Sam's for all their 3,000 calorie break snacks. And now she's a tool of the Iranian government. How did Granny Smith get flipped? Why did Granny Smith get flipped? What's the pros and cons of legitimate but compromised? I'm taking a huge amount of advantage of trusts. During the G7 summit in Switzerland, right, they had the Swiss one, the hotel that the summit was at was down the street from a bakery. And a state compromised the bakery's domain and used it to launch operations into the various G7 members at the hotel. It was geographically in bounds a block away from the site. It was something that you'd expect guests of the hotel to be going to that domain to see what's going on with the fresh breads, because everybody knows Swiss, Austrian, and German breads are delicious. So, took advantage of that trust relationship. Not only in human component, but even in blocking. If somebody said, like, I'm going to block a lot of infrastructure during this summit because it's sensitive, probably not going to block poor Granny Smith's Bake Shop down the street. So ASNs, what's an ASN? Autonomous system, yeah. What is it used for? What is ASN good for? CENs, content delivery network, CDNs. Yeah, absolutely. What else? BGP. It's for money. Money is tied to ASNs. If I want to know the true billing, the true usage of internet traffic, I'm going to have an ASN involved in there. They're super critical to the way the internet works. But outside of the whole BGP complication, if I really want to get to the root of understanding who really owns something, there's no better place to check than billing. ASNs can be extremely useful for that. There's a lot of free tools to figure out the ASNs as well. And look, like I said, I'm from Alabama. I have not the foggiest on how to pronounce that correctly. Yeah, I know. I've heard it every class for years that I've taught. I can't say whatever you just said. I have no idea. It's the Scottish, Welsh, not Scottish people that are pretty good about tracking things on the internet. They do a good job. They have a great tool, though, specifically even to figure out what ASNs are in use from the IP addresses you find. What I want you to note, though, about ASNs is largely to do with your passive DNS providers. I like the passive DNS community. It's a great tool. You're going to use a passive DNS tool, I guarantee it. But the question always comes up, which is better? And there really isn't a right answer, because all of them have different collection, and they have different places in the world they collect. They have different relationships with ASNs and internet service providers, and largely what they're doing is they're having partnerships that allow them to put servers in place that capture domain records as it flies across the internet so they can tell you what's going on in your region of the world. As an example, there's one massive PDNS provider that has amazing relationships with ISPs in China. So if you're dealing with a lot of Chinese infrastructure, that might be a pretty good choice. There's some of them that are largely American-based. And there's various sources, and you have to ask. And every one of these providers is going to refuse to tell you. But then you have to ask generics. Where's your collection? Oh, I don't really go into that. Well, look, for me to make a choice, I need to know the type of collection you have. And you have to press on that. And I know it's hard, but you have to, because you can't not know where your collection comes from, especially as it relates to DNS. But there's a lot of providers. So I've listed some of the free ones that you can just use without any tools and paid, or without any paid subscriptions, like Mnemonic. But there's also a lot of paid ones. Passive Total, Farsight, RiskIQ, OpenDNS got bought up by Cisco. We get a lot of tools. We're going to use a professional tool in class. Here's my asterisk. I don't care. None of them are better than the others to me. We're going to use domain tools. How and why are we going to use domain tools in Recorded Future today? Because I put a call out to all the vendors that interact with SANs. I said, and ones that didn't. I said, hey guys, I'm going to put a tool of this category in the class. Who would like to give my students a 90-day, full, free, premium subscription to your tool, no questions asked, with no ability to harvest off their information, emails, accounts, etc.? Domain tools is the one to respond, so domain tools is in the class. I'm not picking favorites, it's just they're the ones that responded. They're all pretty good or they wouldn't be on the slide. But generally speaking, you'll have your free kind of tools. Even like the domain tools Whois is free versus the paid Iris. You're going to be using Iris in the lab. And free tools do provide good context. They do provide a good place, but generally they suffer in the historical data. They don't have long-term data retention. So especially if I'm looking at more long-term operations, whether they be cybercrime or not, I am going to want some paid tool eventually for that historical context. If we look at Mnemonic and you wanted to use it after class, as a good example, I could type in Game Muster and say, show me everything related to Game Muster, and it'll tell me, look, there's all these other subdomains. The IP addresses were here, even dating back to 2014. No changes, which is useful. Because if I get a domain passed to me by a trusted party and I find out they changed IPs or they changed records or ownership in the last like 6 months, now I may not want to use that because I don't know if it's actually useful in the investigation I'm doing. Passive total, another good option. I'll just tell you to be careful though. A lot of places I see the ability to tag information, but you are bound now to what other people perceive to be related to that domain. What I don't like is all the tags are things like crimeware, which may not be the point, right? I don't like that crimeware, APTware, et cetera type stuff. So be careful of tags, but they can be a good starting place if you've got nothing else to go off of. For the next lab, domain tools. You're going to use this in the lab. So since I have no expectations that you know how to use this, like Redline I don't go into a lot. I give you the walkthrough, but Redline is not a 500 level course topic in this curriculum. Domain tools is. So I want to give you a little intro to using this. So what you are going to do is you're going to take the account that you had, that you registered on day 1 and lab 0 with the information I gave you, and you're going to go to Iris. So you're going to log in, you're going to go to domain tools, I have the URL and everything for you, and you're going to click down that connect and you're going to see Iris. It's not the normal domain tools tool. It's Iris, the professional tool. And Iris is largely a correlation engine on top of all their data. So it's all their historical data, but a lot of correlation. So you're going to go and you're going to type in some data that I give you like a domain. I'm going to use a different example in the slides. So here, I go to carbon2u.com and I search, and then I'll get results returned to me. Here's some things you need to know. The results have all these different little tabs that break out what I can do with that data, like hosting history. Show me all the IP address hosting history over the last like 10 years or more, lots of historical data here, of who's owned it and when and what the IP addresses have changed to. It'll tell you what it was, when it changed, where it changed to. Good information. And I can do that across even things like screenshots. Show me a screenshot of what the website looked like in 2005. Stuff like that's pretty awesome. Now, you might click the little X. If you click the X, please remember that all these little tabs are also at the bottom of the screen as well. Those are the permanent tabs. So it's a weird UI, user experience thing. There's no way to get back that tab once you hit X unless you go to the very bottom of the page and click it again. It's really, really weird. But either way, that's how you do it. Upon pivoting, we can then see things like new domains and email addresses and billing information. 2 things to note. 1, try to see if there's any patterns, right? Maybe they're gaming themed or whatever. I mean, these things matter. In the Corretto campaign with Kaspersky and the Spanish government, they were finding that there were Mexican-based name schemas, which obviously isn't Spain, but there was a theme, which was Mexican-based naming conventions, and it wasn't that they went, aha, it's Mexico. They just saw that there was a pattern. So they started filtering down all the domains they had off of Mexican-based naming conventions, and it was able to take them from millions of domains to tens of thousands. Your goal is to keep filtering that data set down to where you can get to something that's useful. The second thing to note is there are risk scores. Be very, very careful of risk scores. They're a good thing to use if you have nothing else, but what I don't like about risk scores are they're completely non-transparent. They will tell you things like, these are the types of things we're considering, but how do all these companies do risk scoring? Machine learning. So there's a machine learning model that takes in some variables and spits out a number, and so even the vendor doesn't know why the number is what it is. They just know that some variables are tracked. So because it's just a mathematical number that's calculated, please be very careful of it. Some of the vendors are getting pretty good, though, about saying, hey, things out of this portion of the world with these characteristics, with these follow-on things, with this many sandbox queries and blah, 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 might be higher risk. So it's not that it's inherently bad. It's just that it's non-transparent. Exercise 3.1. What we have is the group, or the operation that you're tracking yesterday. You had intrusion sets, and the intrusion set that we're starting to form a campaign off now that we see all this poison ivy data going against Acme Electronics. The reality of the situation is we have enough off the persona and the number of intrusions and the understanding of victimology to come up with a campaign. And so we're going to come up with a campaign for this group. And I've named it for you. And one of the things that makes me most excited about all CTI is naming things. I'm good at it, and I love it. Real quick case study, but a useful one. And the reason I like the GlassRat case study is there's really only one takeaway, one lesson from it that I found exciting, but it's a really, really cornerstone revelation for this case. RSA did a really cool expose into what they called GlassRats. RSA is expose of GlassRat. Anyways, so what they said was, look, there's this remote access Trojan that nobody's been detecting on, and it's been out in the wild for over 3 years. And we found it, and it's been using compromised digital certificates from trusted certificate authorities. That's all nice. Yay, good defense, malware analysis, haha, good job. What I loved was the shared C2. Sometimes what we believe to be distinct groups are actually just different mission focuses of the same team. But I also want to hit that word real quick, believe. I want you to remember, belief is for religion, not intelligence analysis, okay? When we use words, we usually use words like I assess, or it's highly probable, or this is what we have currently based on the evidence that we have. Try to avoid words like belief. Anyways, that infrastructure overlap alone exposed what effectively was a long-term intelligence operation for a state. That's cool. It's one mess up, one mistake. Speaking of dynamic DNS, here was a case study that I thought was awesome. And this one, Hurricane Electric, it was CrowdStrike that did a lot of the good work on this one. What effectively happened, and I like Clever, by the way, nothing impresses me about ODAs and complex malware. All that tells me is you are too basic to actually just do it with less. Or it just tells me you're a consulting firm, like trying to advertise your wares, like, hey, I'm hacking team, let me just throw some exploits, maybe I'll get hired. And I like Clever. I look at an adversary and they're clever. That's what I want to see. This was clever. The adversary, or what happened is CrowdStrike got called in, looking at some capabilities. Other teams got called in, and it looked like there was malware on the system. Absolutely looked like there was something wrong in the network because new communications were beaconing out to places like Microsoft and Adobe and Apple and all these well-known domains. But the researchers at various security firms and various people that responded kind of concluded that those were not likely the actual command and control domains, that it was just internet checking. Why? Because it'd be super hard to compromise all these highly watched domains all at the same time. It's not impossible to compromise Microsoft. It's really hard, but it's really unlikely to compromise Microsoft, Apple, definitely compromise Adobe. Anyways, but compromise all these sites all at once. So people were kind of perplexed. CrowdStrike ended up finding the malware, reverse engineering it, and they found something really surprising. As it turns out, the dynamic DNS provider, Hurricane Electric, at one point in time, all the way up to this case, would allow anybody, anywhere to register a domain for free, including domains that were already registered elsewhere. So you could register Microsoft.com, and you would own it. Now, the problem, of course, is the way that DNS routing and name authorities work, is it would never go to a Hurricane Electric DNS server to resolve Microsoft.com. So you couldn't reliably expect the victim to go there, unless you told it to. You had malware on a system that specifically told it for its DNS servers to go to Hurricane Electric servers to resolve Microsoft.com. So all the defenders were looking at legitimate domains, but they were actually owned by someone else. It was wrong IPs. And do it for all the exfiltration off those environments. That's clever. That's pretty good. All right, so let's get into a case study. So with the Epic Turla case study, everybody's got their favorite adversary. If you don't, you're just not weird enough yet. You will. You'll have your favorite. You're like, man, I really love Equation Group, or I really love, I don't know, Fancy Bear, or whatever. You'll come up with something. And it's a hard thing to appreciate because you like this adversary group. Why do you like this adversary group? Usually it's one of two reasons. Reason number one, you just really respect their tactics and tradecraft. You think it's really cool, really clever, and it happens. Reason number two is Stockholm Syndrome. Right? Number two is you just sort of fall in love with the adversary, and it's really weird and creepy. But it happens. Why does it happen? Because at some point in your career, it's happened to me, some point in your career, you're going to start reporting. You're going to start reporting on an adversary consistently. They're going to show up, you're going to report. You're going to battle with them off and on. This struggle, and it's real, it's exciting, and your management notices. And kudo points come raining down from the sky, and you're doing everything that you've ever wanted to do with Intel. It's really frustrating to get spun up and then not have any bad guys in your infrastructure. That's really annoying. I know it's like kind of weird, but it's annoying not to have any bad guys to go up against. And you're going to find one, and then someday they're going to stop coming. They're going to stop showing up. You have no idea why. Like, but what happened? Why don't you love me anymore? Like, I didn't block you. I didn't stop. What? I'm over here. And go put out some faked-in profiles or something. It happens. It legitimately does happen. Don't do that. But anyways, one of my favorites is Epic Turla. One of the reasons I like Epic Turla so much is, sure, the whole C2 thing is really, really cool, and we're going to get into that. But what I don't have on the slides, because I don't want to put it on the slides, but it's something that you should be aware of, is technically the public information is that Epic Turla started around 2007. That's not real. It started back in 1997. 1997. An operation called Moonlight Maze. This is the team responsible for Moonlight Maze. For those of you that are like, oh, that's them, that's them. For those of you that have no idea what I'm talking about, Moonlight Maze was an operation conducted by the Russian government. We're actually pretty good on the attribution on that one. Conducted by the Russian government to compromise classified networks in the US government. And it became such a big deal that that's actually what started the early working groups that would then become the cyber focus of the National Security Agency, that would build the Threat Operations Center in the early 2000s to counter it, that would be the justification for Cyber Command in the early days. Like a lot of what the government did post 2000, post 1999, 2001, had a lot to do with Moonlight Maze. FBI was working with NSA, who was working with everybody. That was great. It was beautiful. So I really like this group. They're responsible for Agent BTZ as well, which that was the one that also compromised classified networks. How do they do it? USBs. So a lot of people around the world were like, I don't know if we should use USBs anymore. And the US government said, we shall not use USBs anymore, even though they continue to use USBs everywhere. Anyways, we're going to stop using USBs. And the malware was very simple. It would transfer via USBs. When it plugged into a system, it would beacon out to the internet. If it had access, it would stop. And it would wait until it got plugged into a network that when it beaconed out to the internet, it didn't have access, helping it to realize that it was likely behind some sort of segmentation and maybe on a classified network. And then it would activate to try to steal off any of the documents on that network, on that system, and it would pull them back onto the USB, and when it got plugged into another system, it'd beacon out to the internet. And if it got internet connection again, then it would exfiltrate all of its documents. Pretty clever, actually. Turns out it was really easy to find Agent BTZ after we looked as well. Everyone was looking for technical indicators and things back then. Everyone was going crazy. And the question was, can we just pull the DNS logs? They just pulled the DNS logs on CyberNet, classified networks, and there it all was. I'm like, those systems are all compromised because they're beaconing out to the internet off of classified networks. Pretty obvious. So it was really clever, but it was also, once you figured out the behavior of what was going on, pretty easy to find it too. Anyway, so that was them. So Kaspersky Lab helped uncover Epic Turla. Other teams have uncovered different aspects of this group before, but Epic Turla specifically is Kaspersky's naming convention. But like I said, kind of bold move, Cotton, with who the group was. But anyways, I love the command and control of this group. So I'm going to use Kaspersky's graphic and walk through it in the discussion of command and control, because this is clever. So essentially what happens is once somebody is targeted, once somebody receives the malware, instead of going to a known domain or known IP address, it connects up to satellite-based internet connections. And so it uses software to get to satellite-based internet connections, and instead of looking, again, for a specific address or a specific domain, which you could block or pivot off of or research, instead, it looks for a specific region. It says, hey, Northeast Africa. Who is active right now in Northeast Africa on satellite internet connections? And so it would just pick out a currently in use IP address on that satellite internet provider of Northeast Africa. Well, that seems silly, because if you're the adversary, the big challenge there is you have no idea where the data is going. No domain or IP address. Unless you have a physical building in Northeast Africa that is sitting there and hoovering up any of the data that comes through that satellite. And the way that you do that is very simple. When a satellite is transmitting down, they call it a swath. It's a swath of land that it takes up and sort of sends down its signals. That's not a small location. They're huge. The satellite, space, up high. Huge swath of land. Could be anything from tens of square miles, but usually it's hundreds of square miles or more, but usually hundreds of square miles. And so I don't need to know anything other than it's going to be in this 100 square mile radius, and I need to know some sort of triggering packet. So instead of worrying about who it's going to, or what IP address, or what domain, it just has a flag, a little simple packet that says on, or some flag that they know to look for, like a signature across your network data. And then when they see that and all the data that they're sucking down, they flag that and pull it off to the side, and that's their exfiltration. That's their actual command and control. So in essence, that data is getting sent to everybody. And it's definitely getting sent to the active user that has that IP address. But that IP address doesn't have that port or any service open listening for it, so it just drops it. So everybody else drops that network communication. The only people that are actually getting it are the people that set up that flag to get it. And you made it where the adversary doesn't need to know the IP or domain, which means the defenders can't focus on IP or domains either. The next question is, how do you defeat that? Well, you don't get infected. That's a good one. But the other two ways you could defeat it is if you knew what to look for, you too could open up a building with satellites and look. Or, this is a giant hypothetical that is unproven and who would ever know, is completely hypothetical, but you could also have satellites that hover behind other satellites and swoop stuff up. That'd be interesting too, on the uplink. But these places, pretty easy to acquire. They have a breadcrumb style UX, which is awesome. I encourage all of you to think of a breadcrumb. What a breadcrumb is it basically says, here's the query I ran, here's the pivot that I went to, and it keeps building on each other. So if you need to go back because you went down the wrong rabbit hole, you can literally just X back your queries to get to where you were and all the data related to it. For any of your analysis tools, that's one feature you should probably request, is a breadcrumb. Especially when we're pivoting, it's nice to be able to roll it back and do trees off of it. So in this one, carbon2u.com, it tells me, hey, in 2018, here are the IP information related to the host names. Here's some information about it, and I can click anything that's a blue hyperlink. And if you're colorblind, it's just whatever the hyperlink is. But I can click the hyperlink, and it'll say, what do you want to do with it? And I can filter down to it. I could ping it or use traceroute and find new information. Please don't do that. It is available to you, but my general recommendation is in this and recorded future, there's some features that actually have cost to the vendor. Generally speaking, you have a full paid license, but unless you need it for a real use case, don't make the vendor do stuff for you for them being nice. But I might be able to do a new search just off of that, or exclude it. Here's my general rule of thumb. If I click on a data point and it shows me 500 plus, I don't want to see it. It might just be like a sinkhole, right? It might be a lot of IPs being pointed to domains that are sinkholed, or vice versa. But if it's got like 200-300 data points, it might be interesting. This might be something that's connected to another 300 domains off of adversary infrastructure. So I might do a new search based off that specifically. GDPR is extremely confusing to everybody because it was vaguely written on purpose to essentially say you must do things up into best practice. You're like, what the hell does that mean? Well, you've got to take consistent measures to protect people's data. Okay, well, like what type of measures? Whatever you define as to be reasonable within your organization. Like it's this really weird, vague thing. For some organizations, it's impossible. Microsoft is a great example. Microsoft collects so much data that right now off of GDPR, it is physically, like by physics, impossible for them to delete it as fast as they collect it. They have run out of computational power to delete the data as fast as they collect it. That's lovely. For all of you, like, I have big data. Until you have physics challenges, you don't have big data. Microsoft has big data. So to be in compliance with GDPR, which they technically can never be in compliance with because of the laws of physics, what they've essentially done is just put a flag in front of it of a 1 to 0, like old school deleting on disks. Where they just go, all this is deleted, and we're not allowed to look at it anymore, but it's still there. And they just try to delete it as much as possible. I imagine there's somebody running across Microsoft servers with a baseball bat just hitting things at this point. But the regulation was poorly written, is my point. I'm not so sure that I could have done anything better, but it's been poorly written. For your domain providers and ISPs and folks in Europe, because of the vagueness, what they've largely gone towards is no longer collecting. They say, too bad, have fun, we're not getting fined. And so this level of data is drying up quickly in Europe. And this one, you can exclude or include or do searches off that infrastructure, which is good. So I've given you additional domains and information based off of the actual intrusion, and you're going to go work it. Warning, 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 it is OSINT. It is a software-based tool in the cloud. Adversaries change things all the time. Technically, the historical data at a minimum should be consistent in like screenshots and things, but your screenshots, your walkthrough is almost guaranteed to be something different based on the evolution of time and space as it relates to these tools. So work through for the purpose of working through and understanding the methodology. Don't get hung up on screenshots. All right, good luck. All right, exercise 3.1. Domain pivoting. What do we see? And again, this is not one that I'm looking for some magical answer. I mean, there's stuff to find. It's good. But tell me about the process. Tell me about the structure. Tell me about problems. Tell me about opportunities. What did we see? What were some challenges you had in the lab? Overabundance of information. In these types of tools, they flood you with data. If you do not go in with a specific question in mind, you will drown. Even in this lab, I've sort of thrown some data at you, but you're still not working a full-on, full-time investigation. It's like I threw something at you and asked you to do some searches and find some things. It's a kind of crappy requirement. It's not exactly structured. It gets you into the tool and experiencing it, but it's done that way by design. When you go into these tools, I need you to have a reason to go into these tools. I need you to go in saying, I know what the answer looks like. I know that I'm going to go look for a domain. This is malicious. I'm looking for other domains that match the profile or match the structure of what I'm looking for, and my job is to collect another 10 domains or more, whatever's available, and malware samples off of those so that we can identify what malware is coming down. Like, we don't know the malware in our environment. We just know the domain is malicious, and I'm going to go see if I can correlate to find samples of the malware to see if I can look for types of malware like that in my environment. Like, you'll go with a requirement. Or I already know what the malicious software is. I know it's beginning out to an IP address, but I want to go look for infrastructure off that IP address in case I can find the exfiltration or the command and control servers that I can look for in my environment. Or I know that my adversary is doing watering hole attacks, and they're going after banking infrastructure, but they're doing it themed off of banking infrastructure. Let me see if I can find domains that match this theme to see if I can find additional intrusions to look at to help me with this activity group. You'll go in with requirements, but you'll know what you're looking for. Otherwise, you'll just pivot forever and not be able to answer anything. Because there is no magic button at the end that goes, aha, got it. There's nothing. It's a ever abundance full of data. So you've got to be able to pick out what actually works for you and what doesn't. So what are some ways that you use domain-like data today? What are some use cases you have that expose how we use tools like this? Or things that you saw in the lab that are useful? Back and forth, whatever you got. Knowing when the domain was registered is an extremely important thing. Simple example. If you go into your organization, look for all the domains that you have coming out of your infrastructure, what is a very simple thing to look for to know if it's malicious? Or maybe malicious, yeah. Yeah, traffic to domains registered in the last week, last 30 days, last 3 months. Temporally bounding domain registration to say, I know that my users go to Facebook, they go to YouTube, they go to Google. These things have been around for a while. The things that got registered in the last couple months, that's a little bit more interesting. So you'll look for that domain registration dates. Yeah. Nope. What else? Absolutely. Common registrants. There's some registrants, and there's even some like ASNs that just like bad stuff tends to come out of. It's not guaranteed, but again, it's something more to add in. You're going to see 3 or 4 or 5 variables until it clicks and goes, this is more likely to be malicious. Yes. The question was, can we do some sort of wildcard searching to say, here's our behavior that we're looking for, or some moniker that we're looking for, and variations of that? Yes. Your various providers have different ways to do it. In the main tool, there's specifically one that you can just put in the name and say, give me variations of this. It's a function of the tool. We do it. One of the things that we track is for like industrial providers, one of the big ways to get compromised on industrial is compromising the vendors' websites. Because I don't know where every segmented off power plant is going to be. But you know what? They're probably going to use Schweitzer engineering gear. They're probably going to use ABB equipment. They're probably going to use maybe some Rockwell gear every now and then, more manufacturing. But they'll use these vendors. And so I've got a morning query that runs, one of my analysts does, that goes out and looks for all the variations of those vendor names that get spun up. There's not too many. I don't have to crawl the entire world for all these different vendors. But all these different places they go. And multiple times this year, we've caught the beginning phases of a campaign targeted towards the industrial sector, caught it faster than anybody else in the community. They're like, oh, what magic are they doing? It's like, domains! It's like, it's not magic. I looked. Anyway, so that's absolutely a useful thing to do. So in essence, there were numerous campaigns that we did not know might all be linked to the same adversary. It was like, I think it was like something like 10 to 15 different campaigns that people were tracking, and they didn't know if it was all the same group or not. And RSA came out and showed, based off of passive DNS records and off of undiscovered malware over a couple of years, that for one day, they messed up their own internal routing. That's the hypothesis. It's technically an assessment. But it very clearly looks like they messed up on one day and had everything point to the same name server and same registrant for one day. Only way to catch that is passive DNS, and the only way to catch that is to go back in historical and be able to see that. Because you wouldn't have seen it on the exact day. But the beautiful thing about that is that's human error. That's some networking engineer who probably lost his job or more that accidentally correlated a bunch of infrastructure together and, oh, crap. And now operations blown. Yes, no one in the entire security industry saw that over 3 years with all the data right in front of them. No one. Until a needle in the haystack was visible and then somebody pivoted. So you would have to have something to prompt you to go into this data sets. In this case, seeing a bunch of domains that correlated together, you wouldn't have even known to look for that. There's plenty of stuff that go, oh, that's obvious in hindsight bias, but not at the time. Here, what was effective for them is they found the malware that no one else had been tracking, and because it hadn't been tracked, there was never any reporting on it, which emboldened the adversary to be able to do long-term operations that built up a data set. Then when they had a needle or a thread to pull on, then they could look at the data. For you, off of a thread, I bet you could get there in a day. Off of a thread to go back and go, oh, this is Maltego. Have you ever seen like the nice pretty pictures that people put and they swap out icons? Half the time it's just Maltego pictures. That's what's in the report. All that is, they assigned an icon for what they consider glass rat. They put the digital hashes of the malware here, and they did one pivot. Where is it going? Oh, here's this IP address, one pivot. Where is it going? This IP address, one pivot, a domain that connected everything back out. So 3 pivots off of the right data point. It's just difficult to find the right data point. But that's also why I am a strong advocate on your own intrusion data. Because if I'm just going off of an indicator or something that was shared to me or blah, 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 I don't have the context and capability to ask more questions of it. But if I'm working in intrusion and I know the context, and I've got malware samples and other things that I can pivot to if needed, now I can ask the right questions against that data, and now I know what I'm looking for, and those pivots are meaningful. So what generally frustrates analysts and domains is they're not doing intrusion analysis, or they don't have access to intrusions, and they're an intel team in a company that doesn't have direct access to intrusions, and they're told, here's domain tools, here's passive total, go find magic. Everything comes down to intrusion analysis. But I believe you could do it.